us off, or Kevin, whoever?
Thank you very much, Ms. Smith. As a result of one of the previous school board work sessions, we came to the understanding that the intent and consensus of the school board was to go ahead, and I believe it's stated in there in the February 9th, March 16th discussions, to go ahead and proceed with one of the option, I think it was like a third option regarding the queue and what we were going to be doing in the future. So as a result of that, we went back as staff, based upon our understanding of what transpired in this in the previous work session, and the language kind of pointed out to us that there was a little bit of a clarification that was required. When we said revisit, when we said revisit the criteria and maintain funded or named project in CIP cash flow, and reassess all other remaining projects in the queue using the new criteria. Funding projects were ones already in the design or construction. Named projects are listed on the CIP cash flow. We identified those, but what in the end result was, and as attachment B will show, the ramifications to include the named schools as a third option results in the following 10 elementary schools being open to reassessment in the queue and a possible delay of 18 months to 3 years. Now, there were two things that staff row was kind of looking for clarity on, is that, each of these are in different parts of the county. Hydla Valley Elementary School that had the Q rank of 33, Washington Mill, Braddock Elementary School, Fox Mill Elementary School, Oak Hill Elementary School, Wakefield Forest Elementary School, Louis Archer Elementary School, Crossfield Elementary School, Mosby Woods Elementary School, and Bonnie Bray Elementary School. So staff was really looking to have further clarity that, in fact, by doing this, that is the intent, because this was the direct result. And we didn't have the opportunity to provide that clarity of the impact, or perhaps looking for additional clarity that, no, that wasn't the intent. We still want this to proceed in the manner that it was, but we want you to do something different. So that's really the purpose of today's.
And I would just kind of to restate what Jeff was saying. You all remember this work session, and there was lots of discussion, lots of debate. In fact, we even modified the options during that work session based upon the discussion. And so we felt like because that conversation was essentially in the abstract, we have an obligation to you all to show you impact before we move forward with that. Because it wasn't officially approved, it was approving in concept. And we want to be able to reflect that in the formal CIP or maybe in further actions at some point down the road. So because it was an abstract conversation, we felt like we needed to make sure everyone understood the impact of that direction.
Yeah, and I know in talking to some board members, I don't think board members realized that by doing that, 10 schools would be jumped over. So I think what we're looking for in this discussion is clarity about the purpose of the board and our expectations for staff. So there's a decision that could be made that says, okay, we want to do the schools through Falls Church and we don't want to jump. Does the board understand by doing just the funded and named that we are going to jump over 10 schools, and that is our decision? So we're looking for clarity and consensus in that decision. So I'm looking for anybody that wants to make comments. Tammy.
I appreciate the clarity, and I am really not supportive at this time of having 10 schools jumped over. So I'll just start by stating that.
Thank you. Ted?
I am not in support of having 10 schools jumped over.
So maybe I have to peel the egg off my face for not fully grasping the implications here. But what I intended when we last talked about this was to leave the current queue order intact. That would be, we would be open to revisiting the criteria, and that if the criteria changed, those criteria would be applied to the remaining schools. It was not my intent to change the order of the queue, which by using the phrase named schools, we appear to have done. So I'm in agreement with Tammy with a lot more words. So I think what I think one of the things you said was that we would leave the queue order in place through Falls Church without the jump, and then it would apply to everything else, and I would agree with that.
Can I
Thank you.
just make
Yes.
one clarification? What you see on the screen here, what's underlined, it's the new language that was added from the March 16th work session, which results in the impact that we're currently discussing. So I just wanted you to know that those are some of the changes that we had made since during the March 16th work session.
And I think that's what we're looking for clarity from the board, whether this is what we want to do. And I've already heard a couple of board members say this is not what we want to do, that we don't want to jump 10 schools. Dr. Garza?
Would it be helpful to go to this document? I know Board Docs is still not working for me. It's this one with the listing of all the schools, so the board members have that in front of them. I think it B. Oh, is it working now? I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking this way to see if hands up. Patty?
Well, I have a lot to say, but I'll start with just a question. So I guess I'm going to be requesting a go back because I would like to understand from staff, looking at this chart, if you scroll down, you'll see on the column that says named in CIP cash flow, you'll see a bunch of blanks, which in fact are the schools we're talking about, and then you'll see a yes by Falls Church. So what in fact does it mean to be named in the CIP cash flow? Because that's something we agreed to some time ago. So without getting into all the details, I just want to make sure we all understand what is the significance of having that say named in CIP cash flow.
It really was a part of the CIP document that actually had the listing of the schools, and it showed when the funding would be identified for it. So if the school was listed, like when we had renovations, you'd have a listing of individual elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools.
Well, let me.
Yes, sorry.
Let me address that. Typically, in the past, we haven't named a school out of order, and I don't remember if it was Sandy's amendment. There was something that we did to name Falls Church, even though it wasn't next, so it got named. Typically, a school didn't get addressed till it had the cash flow. So that's why when this was looked at and talked about with the board, it was looking at funded, because we had agreed ages ago that if something was funded, we weren't going to pull it out because there was a community expectation. But because Falls Church was named, the wording became funded and named. And so now the discussion in front of the board is, did we realize that 10 schools that were ranked I guess, lower than Falls Church would get jumped over? And so the board really has to be very clear about our decision, about whether we do think those 10 schools should be named or not, so there's clarity to staff, and then where we want the new criteria to take place, and then there'll be a discussion of the timing of when that needs to happen. So the question in front of you is, do you want to jump those 10 schools? Are you done? Are you
I'd
thinking?
like to defer to hear some more discussion, and then I'll request a go back.
Sandy?
Well, I thought we were all clear a month ago when we made this decision, so I'm surprised to hear that people were unclear on what we were doing, because we did have exactly this document in front of us a month ago when we voted to do this. And I guess I would like to get Dr. Garza's view on this as well.
My view about the process,
Well,
it's what I said earlier. I felt like, we have a responsibility to reflect what this board wants to do. And because it was, I think, a conversation that was pretty convoluted, and certainly in the abstract, it's not, I do get the issues we have at Falls Church High School, it being a high school. I totally get that. But I do understand the implication of jumping over schools too. So we need to have have this in a position where we can have confidence that we have board support for it, if that's in fact what the intent was for us to move it up. So it's really, I think, our responsibility to bring this back and show the implications of it, and if that's still the direction of the board, then that's the way we'll head. I was curious about Cooper Middle School and Frost Middle School. There seems to be, like Hobble Valley, there's a blank there, but then it goes to Cooper and Frost. Do you know? That's kind of the same question about Falls Church, right? That was shown as a yes.
Yeah, so we all know that the planning cycle for high and middle schools are significantly longer than for elementary schools. So back in 2013, when we included Falls Church, these schools were already named. So that meant typically you would name a school in the CIP if any of the funding hit within that CIP window, which is a 5-year time frame. So in 2013, I guess it would have been FY 14 to 18. Some of these, like Highville Valley, actually, and at that time we were already having discussions about the Q criteria, and we received direction not to name any more schools in the CIP. So if you look at this year's CIP, it says funding, there's 10 elementary schools listed, which are really these. The funding occurs and would have occurred in a couple of years. They would have already been named, but right now it just says renovation at 10 elementary schools. And that included this set, and this was related to the Q meetings that we started a couple of years ago, honestly. So, yes, Highville Valley would show up very soon. It should have already been named in the CIP, absent those prior conversations. But the funding for an elementary or middle or high will occur sooner on the planning cycle than an elementary. But I have the CIP timing as close as I can that they bid in order. So 20 would bid, then 21, 22, regardless of the school size. I try to keep it as close as possible.
Sandy, were you done?
Well, yeah. I mean, the conversation we had a month ago was, can we do something more for Falls Church? You know, we certainly talked about Falls Church High School, and we talk about it, and we talk about it, and we talk about it. And this was finally a way that we were going to find to get a process that would help Falls Church High School, our very last legacy high school. And so I would be very disappointed if this board went back on the decision that it made a month ago to do that. We did find a process that made sense. And so I guess I had a couple of questions about, you know, when we look at where we are now, when is Langley going to be finished with construction?
Be about 3 years from now.
So in 2018?
Approximately, that's correct.
Okay.
In the fall of 2018.
And if we pull Falls Church High School back down, when was the best case scenario for when they could be completed?
Well, right now, assuming that we maintain the current projects without moving any of these, I had the Falls Church planning in the 17 bond, and I think we could probably get the construction in the 19 bond.
And so when would construction finish?
It would start roughly
Well,
the 22nd.
Yeah, I mean,
22. And they're 4 years.
yeah.
Well, but it takes, so construction, I think you were,
I think, I mean, look, we're talking a couple of years from now, and
Yeah.
it's some uncertain market, so it's difficult to project out 6 or 7 years. But assuming that,
All
you know,
things
inflation
equal.
stays the same, and
Right.
knowing what I know right now, the projects that are currently in the CIP, you know, it looks like construction would start sometime in 2021.
and so it would be finished in 2024 approximately.
correct.
So nearly a decade from now, a school that's at the same era as Langley, which is going to be finished in 2018. So I have a very hard time
6 years.
accepting that that's the best we can do for this last legacy high school. This board has talked about how we need to do something. We found a way to do something for them a month ago, and I would hope we would stick with that.
I do have to say that there was not a recognition on the board from members that I talked to about what was happening. So I do think this is a worthwhile conversation to have so that we are very clear. I have Elizabeth and then Megan.
So this is our third facilities discussion in as many months on a work session. I guess I don't understand actually how this even made it back onto the work session, because I, like Sandy, found it incredibly clear last time. So I don't know why there is confusion. I thought, although it was out of context, the intent of what we were trying to do was clear. So this is the problem with the facility side. Operationally, we all get money for our schools. Once you start getting into capital, the last two work sessions, everybody became the Balkans. And as I look down this list, the thing that's missing, and I don't know if you can go back to the list of the 10 on the agenda item: Lee District, Mount Vernon District, Braddock District. Hunter Mill, Braddock, Hunter Mill, Sully, Providence, Braddock. So 2 of our board members represent 6 of the schools on this list. And so, what you're seeing is again, a balkanization of nobody wants to move or be jumped or whatever if it involves a school in their district and could potentially disappoint their constituents. And the problem is that doesn't get down to the fundamentals of priorities. And what are the priorities in terms of the most antiquated or the most desperately in need of renovations or the most desperately in need of seats? And this is something I've been advocating for in the CIP to say, and why I've sent, copies of the Prince William CIP to people before, where it spells out very, very clearly that this year's CIP is the stuff we're doing now. Next year's CIP is the stuff we've committed to, probably financially, and is already underway. And after that, it's a plan. And things change. Population changes, needs change, buildings, age. And if we don't have the ability to be nimble as a board, if we get, our feet in concrete on a document and we can never change it, then we're not governing, we're just managing a list. And it is our requirement under the Virginia Constitution to manage this division to the utmost efficiency. And utmost efficiency doesn't mean that a list was written at some point in the past and it's carved in stone and it can't ever be changed. It's got to be changed based on the realities and the needs of the children and the seats and the age of the facilities, and potentially to correct past wrongs, overlookings, et cetera, like happened with Falls Church. So it was clear to me there's going to be some hunkering down based on whose schools these are, but we've got to get away from that.
I just want to be really clear. It was my decision and my decision alone to add this back to the work session. We've had every month at least 1, 2, or 3 conversations about the new development of a CIP that's different than what we've had in the past. The discussion that was had the last time we had this discussion was it's not a decision. You weren't posted a decision. It was trying to give us guidance. And at some point, I was going to have to bring this back to you for action. We can have this conversation at this table, or we can have this conversation, at a formal meeting. But we have to have. You had to know what the. I grant these are hard decisions. I get it, But it was my decision to bring this back because I didn't feel like we, as staff, were in a position to move forward as a board action item until you all had an opportunity to discuss and know what the implications are of that. So we certainly didn't want to make things more difficult for board members, but at the same time, we need to be doing what's right and what you all think is right for the system as a whole.
Well, I really appreciate that clarification because that does help understand how this made it back onto the agenda when I thought it was, was a completed, we'd already been down this road. But understanding that the staff needed more direction from the board in terms to be able to go ahead and create the next CIP where we're hoping to see, further transparency, et cetera. That's terrific. But to my colleagues, the issue about the priorities and being, beholden to a prior list, despite, what's changing around you, an unbending oak is going to split. So
I have Megan, then Dan, then Janie.
Okay, first question I have is the range that these 10 elementary schools might be delayed is 18 to 36 months. What ends up impacting why it's 18 versus 36 or that range?
Yeah, there are a number of different factors. And as you heard Mr. Sneed say when he was asked about projecting in out years, there are a number of different variables that impact our whole CIP. The bidding climate is one. Okay. We currently have a need where we had identified infrastructure replacement to the tune of $13.1 million that was supposed to be funded in a different venue. That hasn't come to fruition as of this date. While we're hopeful people consider it and reflecting and praying that we will receive those additional funds, they're not there. And that then has to be funded through our capital improvement program and protracts everything. So when you look at the impact of what's going on, the turbulence in this area, that's why you have the range of 18 to 36.
But technically then everything on this list is going to could have another 18-month window.
Well,
everything going forward.
so what happens when you move? So when I answered the question earlier about the timing of the we have a hard cap of, we have a cash flow cap. So we can never exceed 155. This year, for instance, we are because we had some savings in prior years, but typically we're going to spend around $155 million. So if you take a project like Falls Church, I mean, the high schools are big. It's worth about 4 or 5 elementaries when you total it up. There's a total of 10, and right now they're all in a specific bidding order to maintain the cap. So when you slide that forward, that's what happens. They just move. I mean, there's still other projects around these that would come afterwards as well. And we have new schools that are mixed in this group. So I think 18 to 36 months is actually pretty good.
No, but what I'm saying is this isn't in a vacuum. So everything that's in this list and into the future is all a guess, and so at best it would be 18 months. At worst, it could be 36 months. But everything on here could be shifted a year and a half later, depending on the facilities climate and the capital. Correct?
That's correct. No matter what, yes, the prices go up, everything moves. If you introduce new capacity requirements, everything moves.
Sure.
That's
so
correct.
my point of the question, which you're being very helpful to, is to say to my colleagues, okay, no one likes an 18-month delay, but understand all of these schools on here could be looking at another 18 months from when they think something's going to happen, depending on where they are in the funding structure. So in my mind, really, it's more a matter of you're looking at 18 months from where they are in the best projection for all of these schools, because all of them could have another 18-month delay depending on what happens down the road. I mean, am I correct? Because the bottom line is that it's not just these 10 schools. It's going to be everything in going forward from those as well.
Right, but the order's going to be maintained.
Right.
So regardless.
The order's maintained, but the
so-
wait time. In other words, I think what's giving people pause is, could we put Falls Church up ahead, and then the other 10 have to wait 18 months longer than expected?
That's a
Yes.
definite. That's
Okay,
a minimum.
yes, and what I'm trying
More.
to say is 18 months as a trade-off to a school that's one of our last legacy school. I think that's where the conversation goes. The 36 months is all of them, even if we didn't leapfrog over all of them. You're saying if the climate's bad or the 13 million that we now aren't seeing coming, everything, yes, your rank is still there, but when we're going to get to you could be 18
No,
months.
it's
Right,
always
so-
going to be much more severe if you move Falls
Yeah.
Church ahead of those. Regardless, right.
Yeah, and if I could just clarify, yeah, you raised an excellent hypothetical debate about the impact and the potentiality of 18 versus 36 and market conditions. It's very challenging at best to go ahead and do these forecasts and do the CIP and do the bond referendum that we have 2 weeks to get together. So when we look at these things, you're right, we put it in the context of those fluctuations. So if you want to take that as a conversation and just put it in this box here, the other box is the real impact of going ahead and making that change would be displacing those 10 projects. So simply put, it would. So that getting to your point about, which is very accurate about, if things do change abruptly, if we have a severe depression, we can't clarify what the impact will be on that. Yes, you're right. We could have that conversation. But you are taking these 10 and putting that one there. And so your point about that should be the conversation. I'm not arguing that. I think it's been stated quite clear that the impact and some of the individual members of your own body saying that basically I appreciate you bringing this back because that wasn't my understanding, proves the validity of having this conversation. Even these points that you're making up about other factors that influence market conditions, et cetera.
But I'm actually bringing this up as sort of a pushback to say when we are looking at a CIP with this far of projection and all the other external factors that none of us can control, then going to the extreme of saying it could be as much as 3 years or 36 months, it's that's the worst case scenario. But then this whole list is going to could be impacted by worst case scenario. So it's all right. We don't need to debate this point. My bigger point next is for my colleagues is 2 of these elementary schools sit solely within Braddock District. Wakefield Forest Elementary and Bonnie Bray are virtually 100% feeders within Braddock District. Well, Braddock Elementary I share with Sandy, but I'm just saying in terms of where I don't share Wakefield and Bonnie Bray other than with my at-large colleagues. I mean, those are full feeders within Braddock. So my point is, I do have skin in the game. This is going to affect my district, what we do here. So my question would be, I hope you guys might be able to speak to the condition of these elementary schools in your professional judgment. Is there a range of the renovation needs within these 10? Are they, they all fall into the category of where Falls Church is? Or do you think that because I'm really struggling with the fact, like Sandy Evans brought up, we're talking about a legacy high school. It's the only one left. And, I've been inside Wakefield Forest. I've been inside Bonnie Bray. They're beautiful schools. I don't walk in there and feel like I'm walking through a Falls Church. So I guess what I feel like is missing from all of this is, and it goes to Elizabeth Schultz's point, are you going to govern or are you going to manage? We're looking to you guys and Dr. Garza to say, okay, we understand the framework, but we're now having to make some very human, highly sophisticated decisions. And I feel like this is missing. Just seeing a rank order and saying, I don't like jumping the queue, that's where we were 3 conversations ago. What I really would like to hear from you gentlemen is, here's what we're recommending based on the condition of these schools. And when you look at educational needs, where are we I think, making the most strategic and significant decision about the greatest need for renovation. And it's just uncomfortable is different from which ones are saying, all things being equal, you've really got to get to this.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for that pressing question. If you look at attachment A, the initial attachment A, all of the current criteria that are waiting have resulted in the prioritization and numerical ordering of these projects. That's based upon the number of factors that were approved by school board and the direction, the guidance provided by that. And therein lies the framework within which, whether we like it or not, simply put, that is the answer. Period.
So the ranking of those 10 elementary schools versus where Falls Church is, again, keep in mind, apples to oranges. You have a high school ranking list and you have elementary school ranking list, right? So so you're telling me that all those elementary schools are in worse condition than Falls Church, and that's why they need to be renovated? No, Kathy, I asked them to answer that.
So if you look at the criteria, it wasn't based on age and condition. When the board gave us direction, so that was not the criteria which determined the order. The second aspect, the reason that the board created this new queue was so they did not have a separate ranking for elementary, middle, and highs. They combined them into one single ranking deliberately. That's what the board elected to do at that time.
Which board and which year? In other words, let me
2008, 2009.
Okay,
and the board actually, we had one or two work sessions about the criteria, and the board gave us direction on the criteria and the weighting before we ever had a third party go out to evaluate.
Kevin, let me just ask you this, because they're going to get concerned about time. I appreciate what you just said there. That was the question I was wanting to understand. This current queue of schools is based on a criteria of a prior board, not this board. So the ranking of those elementary schools on where they fit is based on the prior board, correct? So 7 years ago. So the question is, this board, which has been here for now 3 years, has been talking for 3 years about the fact that we are not comfortable with the prior ranking in the queue and what it did to Falls Church. So where I'm struggling is, it goes again to, we've had 3 different conversations where some of us said, we can sit here and say it's a shame what happened in the past and it is what it is. But I thought that this board started to say, we want to understand which facilities now, based on your leadership, Dr. Garza's leadership, and this board's leadership, is in greatest need for renovation. And is it your position right here, this is what I'm trying to understand, that those 10 elementary schools are in greater need of renovation by your professional judgment, not the board guidance?
Megan, I'm going to stop us here. It gets confusing when you talk about prior board or current board because it's a board and it doesn't matter who the members were. And the issue is these assessments were made by an independent engineering firm. To ask our staff members if they agree or disagree, they have not gone out and done an assessment. So the work in front of the board is based on this current queue and where the schools are. That just by staff members going and walking through a school isn't the detailed assessment that you get by the independent engineering firm.
I have to say this almost feels like Groundhog Day, and I can only imagine it feels that way for you guys. I understand everything that Ms. Smith just said. That has not been lost on me. What I thought I've heard for the last 3 years is enough members on this board saying, we understand what renovation queue was created by the prior board, and yes, it does matter. Those were 12 elected officials from before. Now we have 12 elected officials that were elected for this current board, and we have every right to change everything at any point in time.
Dr. Garza?
Let me weigh in if you don't mind. Again, this goes back to what I kind of said earlier. We don't, as your superintendent and as our great staff that we have, we do not have the authority to change the criteria or the listing and the ranking of schools. The board has to tell us if you want that. Y'all have to act to change the criteria if you want the criteria to change. So, I mean, the conversation started last month when we had this on the criteria. If you wanted us to reevaluate and redo the criteria, and if you wanted us to re-rank. Okay, that was really the first time that you all, I know you had expressed frustration. I know board members have expressed frustration. That's why we brought the conversation to you all, because it's something that you all wanted to talk about. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to tell us whether or not you want that criteria to change. And yes, we're not, we aren't engineers and architects. I mean, we can apply different criteria to schools. We can actually go out and hire evaluation of the schools again. But it has to be it's the decision of the board to change the criteria, if that's in fact what you want. It wouldn't be us doing that.
So this is without going into all the other details, we just have to let staff know today, is the decision only the funded and named, which creates the jumping the 10 schools? Is the decision that the board looks at that and the board as a whole doesn't want to jump 10 schools, so we're going to say that it's going to be the funded and through Falls Church named, but we want to keep them all in order up to Falls Church? That's really where the decision lies, so that we know what we're dealing with and then at what point we want to have the reevaluation with the criteria. So we already said we're going to want to look at the criteria, but staff needs to know which schools do we want included. So that's what I'm looking for from board members. I've already heard a couple board members say they don't want to jump the 10 schools. I've heard some board members say that they do want to jump the 10 schools. That's the little simple piece I'm looking for, so staff knows which schools we're dealing with.
So let me just make sure I'm clear from the statement we're getting from staff. You had a professional engineering company go out in 2007, 2008. What's the most recent assessment?
2008, and
Okay.
the queue was finalized in January
Okay.
of 2009.
Okay, so from that point, when this new board was seated 3 years ago, and we started having conversations about the old criteria, do we change the criteria? In those 3 years' time, does anyone within FCPS have any professional assessment to say what we have is not what the board decided? We look to you all for your professional assessment. So is it your assessment that the 2009 decision-making in your minds, where we strategically need to renovate the buildings most in need of renovation, are being reflected in this list, keeping it as status quo? Or would, for the benefit of the system and the children who get educated, are there buildings that we really should be thinking about renovating sooner
Point of
rather
order,
than
Madam
later?
Chair.
Yes.
I believe it's unfair. The question that Ms. McLaughlin is posing is unfair because this is ultimately a political decision, and she's asking the staff to weigh in on a political
No,
decision.
it's not a
Megan,
political decision.
Megan,
I'm asking
no,
the physical
here's-
status of those buildings. How is that political?
Excuse me. Here's the answer, and the superintendent already said it. Staff does not go out and evaluate the buildings any differently. This is what the superintendent said, and this is what Jeff told you, is that they have this list to work with. There is no other decision. We're working from this list, so there's not another order. So I want to move on to the next board member, okay?
And then I would say one more thing about this. Ultimately, you're the ones that have to be accountable should this list change. Because you're going to have communities that can come to you and say, why am I not in the same order? And if in fact that you all still feel that that's the best direction, great. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, this is stating the obvious, that you have to account to this decision in your community. And so that's why I think this conversation is really important.
I have Dan and then Janie.
Okay, so I think there is some confusion. I know there's a little bit of confusion on my part, but I think we've come back to what I thought I understood from our last meeting, which is boards approve criteria. Criteria then are used by independent third parties to assess our schools and identify what, based upon the criteria that the board has approved, where those schools fall into that need for renovation. Staff then has brought back, as they did in 2008 or 9, whenever that last was, and said, okay, here's the criteria you said, here's what the independent third party said are the appropriate listings for schools to be renovated. Is this what you want? And is this how we should move forward? And the board at that time, I'm not aware of any changes that we made in that queue. We said, yes, we will go with that. Now, looking back on that, in my mind, I know we made at least one mistake, which is basing part of that queue on enrollment and the capacity and the how full that school was. And at least for me personally, I wouldn't do that again. But that at the time, that was part of the criteria that affected where some schools were on the queue.
No, so we need to clarify that.
Yeah,
Because
that's
that's
correct.
not this list, though.
In
I'm sorry,
November,
you said that was correct, what I just said.
right?
Yeah, at the beginning, and then it
In
was pulled out.
November of 2008, we had one ranking.
But can you hold a second?
yeah, I'm sorry.
I just want to make sure that Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Schultz hear this, because I think it's important that they hear this. Thank you.
So in November of 2008, we had an initial ranking that included capacity. At that time, the Mason District representative had some objections to the fact that capacity was included. So we directed the third-party architects and engineers to remove that as a factor. We had a second ranking, which is what we currently have with capacity removed. So there were a number of schools that dropped, moved further back, West Springfield, some of the high and middle schools, and then some that actually moved ahead with capacity removed, right, as a factor. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. So the bottom line to all this is that the board at that time said, okay, here's our queue until we change it, basically. And the board has not changed it. So now the issue before us, as it is every year and every meeting that the board has, it can change it anytime it wants. I think so far so good, hopefully. So now we've said we want to look at that criteria, and we've been doing that the last few meetings and saying, okay, maybe there should be a change, maybe not, and we're about ready to make some kind of decision on that criteria. Because once we've made that decision, the next step, as I understand, is we are going to once again go out and engage a third-party engineering and architectural firm or whatever to go in and look at our buildings and then put them again in the order of a queue based upon that criteria and then bring it back to us, correct? Nobody knows for sure what that will be because conditions of the buildings could have, well, I'm sure have changed in 6 years. Some maybe are not as bad as others, if you will. And so where that ends up, none of us really know for sure, but we know that they'll be coming back with a list. Can you give me at least, or give us the general timeline that you were looking for to do that?
I would think that we would want to have the rankings done by the summer of 2016. This way they would be ready for the fall of 2017 bond referendum, which is where the planning for this set of projects would start. Not all of them, but some of them would show up in the 2017 bond.
So a firm would be engaged. They would be tasked to do this. They would bring their results back sometime in the spring or late spring of 2016. Ultimately comes to the board. The board then will be considering that and making ultimately a decision sometime in 2016 as to what the criteria, what the queue will be going forward for the next 5 to 8 years or whatever length of time that is.
Right. So you would do the criteria, yes. Then we would have the rankings. This way, by the spring of 17, we would know the exact order. We could start to put that bond together.
Okay, maybe I missed it. So you're saying the criteria itself wouldn't be finalized until the spring of 2016?
I would have the criteria because we can't rank it without the criteria because you have to provide the weighting and what is important. That's correct. 16.
Now I'm a little confused because we've been talking about criteria here for the last several meetings. Are we not going to make this board here isn't going to make some kind of decision based on that?
That has not happened yet. I think what Kevin was just discussing was kind of working backwards from when we want to do the 2017 bond package, right? Which means we have to know by spring of 2017, 16, for the criteria, but working backwards in spring of 2017, we kind of have to know which projects are going to be in the November of 2017 package. So working us back to then we need to know what the queue looks like in the summer of 2016. But before we could do that, we need to know what the criteria is going to look like.
So when would the third parties be expected to be actually doing their assessment of schools?
I think based on what Kevin just said, we're expecting maybe the mid-2016.
After we establish the criteria.
Okay.
Correct.
And then ultimately, that would come back to the board. I mean, just in
Yes,
general,
sir.
I realize it may change, but
Ultimately, we come back to the board. Yes, sir.
in the fall of 2016 or the spring of 2017, just help me understand.
It would be fall of 16.
Okay. So I did misunderstand one part of this because I thought that's what we were working on now was the queue that would be, the criteria that would be used as part of that. Okay. So having. The criteria? Yeah, it's the first one.
There it is.
Okay, so the conversation then is, do we want to make, and I understand the advocacy to move at least Falls Church High School ahead of what our, at least consider moving that ahead of our existing queue process. But I had always understood that that would be done as part of this third-party review to say, where are we at that point in time? And what I hear you saying now is that we're a year and a half away from even really making any decision about that, which means that you're looking at potentially impacting what we're doing, although maybe not, depending upon, you could move expeditiously if something were identified as being higher on the list. They could be moved more quickly. So Falls Church may or may not be moved up either today or may not be moved up a year and a half if it's not moved up today, or at least more part of our discussions now. Okay. My personal advocacy I want to use third-party independent folks to look at our stuff and give us a good idea of what's going on and which ones are most important for us to renovate sooner rather than later. That is, to me, the paramount way to do this, the appropriate way to do this. But as a layperson and as somebody generally in the school system and going to school buildings, et cetera, I recognize that there's a huge challenge in the Falls Church community not having a school that, frankly, is as nice to attend as some of the other communities. So, and anybody who's been in Falls Church, I gotta believe is going to agree with me because the school is worn and doesn't have the look and feel of really most of our other high schools in the system. So, I frankly have a dilemma. I'm more than willing to support doing something more, but I would prefer to have that done in the context of what we've always done, which is to have third parties review and say, yes, this is truly needy, or no, yeah, there's a need there, but it still doesn't match whatever this other elementary school or need or high school or middle school, or whatever that is. So I'm torn about this, even though I recognize that we need to move this issue forward. So that's been my confusion up till now, and I don't know if it's helpful to anybody else to walk through this.
So what I'm hearing you say is a third option that would be to, in the reevaluation, have Falls Church be part of that reevaluation too?
I think when we go back and have our third parties review this, we need to do it sooner rather than later. I would like to see it done sooner rather than later, because I think that would give us a better ability, because we know we're ending the queue, at least the formal queue as we know it now. I mean, when you go to 6 or 7 years, you're at the end of the life cycle, if you will, the previous evaluations that were done. And so I think it's timely and appropriate that we do that and have that life cycle evaluation and that facility evaluation done sooner rather than later, and then have a true independent assessment of how bad is Falls Church relative to these other 9 or 10 schools. My perception is that it's valuable and important, and we probably ought to do it sooner or later. But I'm not, an engineer or an architect, and I don't see maybe what they can see.
And part of the feedback we had gotten about timing was when FPAC looked at the cash flow and provided feedback to us about, how far out we'd be anyway. So not to rush it. Okay, Janie.
I have a couple of specific questions about schools that are already in the list. Okay, Oakton is in planning, Oakton High School.
That's correct.
And when would they be on the bond for construction?
They'll be in the 2017 bond.
So 2017 bond for construction. West Springfield is planning for construction in the 2015.
Yeah, West Springfield will be in the 2015 bond for construction, and as well Herndon.
As well as Herndon. And what about Frost?
Frost.
Because we have a yes, but as to where they are.
And so Frost will be in the 17 bond. Yeah, and then 19 for construction.
Okay, for planning and construction. Okay, I'm sorry, say that again. I'm sorry, it's 2017 for planning,
19 for construction.
19 for construction, and Oakton is 2017 for construction. Okay, then Hybla Valley. Isn't that part of the whole Route 1 corridor? What are we going to do?
Correct. I mean, there will be some effect on Hybla Valley if we build the new elementary school down there in Route 1. It could have an impact on the ultimate size of
On enrollment.
Hybla
Okay.
Valley, yes.
Okay. Is Louise Archer in Vienna, and are they subject to the difficulty with overcrowding and issues of trailers?
So they have a modular
Right.
presently that houses the students associated. Most of their overcrowding, they're a fairly large AAP center. They are starting to moderate somewhat in their enrollment because of the fact that the Marshall AAP students are now shifting over to Westbriar. There is some complexity involving the modular. In the town of Vienna, those are not permanent structures like the rest of Fairfax County, so there's a sunset clause this year, and we need to go back before the town of Vienna Planning Council, and hopefully they'll let it stay after this year.
So Louise Archer is subject to that same
Yes,
Vienna town,
yes,
so
it is.
that's a conflicting situation. If, again, going back, if the 10 elementary schools, in other words, if the numerical queue as it stands here were adhered to, I'm sorry again, for Falls Church High School, planning and construction, tell me again where that would be for
So
Falls
we would, we would start the planning right at the beginning after the 17 bond passes.
So they would be on the 2017 for planning.
Yeah, and I think if nothing else changes right now, they would probably start construction sometime in 21. It would be shortly before the 21 bond. I mean, it's the same situation. Herndon
Right.
doesn't bid until September of 17, but that's a couple months before the bond, which is why they're on the 15 bond. And I think that Falls Church would be in a similar situation.
Okay, so then, however this goes through, Falls Church obviously comes then after Oakton in terms of order of how we're getting to.
Correct.
Okay. And if the elementary schools were basically pushed back in order to bring Falls Church forward, when would Falls Church then be?
I think we would wind up picking up time there because you would have the available cash to bid the job. That's the real issue, is that in 2020, so we don't exceed our cash flow. These high schools,
I know they take so
a
much
year,
money.
once they're in full construction, consume
I
a
know,
little
most
over
of the
about
cash flow.
25% of the total cash flow.
So the
Right,
difference in the
right.
timing right now, if the queue remains as it is, planning 2017 bond, construction 2019 bond. So, I'm sorry, going back, no matter what we do, is it still planning on the 2017 bond?
Yeah,
Okay.
because right now, I mean, we're getting ready. This bond package is about ready to go.
Right.
We put together.
So Falls Church, no matter what we do, the planning would be in 2017, and then the construction would be in 2019.
that
but
would be the
quest-
best case scenario.
That would be the best case. So that if the elementary schools were bumped, it would mean that Falls Church could move up a year or two
Yeah, I would
in
say
construction, 2020 instead
Yeah.
of, all right, so we're talking about a year's difference to Falls Church,
at least a year, right?
and
around there.
anywhere from 18 to 36 months for
Yeah, it
For
just
the
depends. The other thing is when they start to move, I mean, we anticipate no matter what, we're running about a 3 to 4% increase in the cost. So you start to, the cost
I know, and
somewhere
that we
goes a
can't
little bit
control.
higher. Yeah.
If we were to go back, and I appreciate Mr. Stork was saying, it is, if you're going to rearrange the queue, and then when the community asks you why and on what basis, that's always a difficult piece. Is it at all possible to go back in and have a short-term reevaluation of Falls Church as well as these 10 elementary schools? Would that make any sense at all? I don't know.
Just using this,
keep in
the
mind-
current criteria?
Yeah.
The criteria, the difficulty that I have here is the length and duration. Okay, the proper context is the School Board Policy 8258.1 declares that we desire to have a 20 to 25 year replacement renovation cycle for our facilities. We're at about 37 years. So all
Or
of these
50.
conversations and the frustrations, correct, all of these conversations and frustrations about timing and sequence are really because of that funding shortfall and the cap imposition that we have. That being said, these are the cards we're dealt with. When we look at actually looking at this, then it would be, we've taken a year of discussion of work sessions and about all of these different issues. And I think Mr. Stork made it very linear and sequential, very clear that the essential item is to go ahead and identify what the actual criteria weightings and the criteria components have been. So to answer the question, it would be if we could get the criteria done in an efficient and effective manner, and we all are individual creative leaders here, we have different perspectives on different vantages of what that may look like. We've been going a year and having the discussion about criteria, about Q, about the rankings of previous, and that time, I'm suggesting from experience, we may not be able to get it as, if I could get an evaluation criteria, an evaluation done by third-party engineers prior to going out for the 17 referendum, I would say absolutely. If you want to say go ahead and stop and reevaluate and redo these criteria because things may have changed and things may have become different, my experience has been professionally that when you actually do go out and take a look, if the criteria are the same, you don't find much change.
Okay.
You generally don't find
You
much
don't find
juxtaposition.
change. Okay.
However, that being said, if you change the criteria, if there's a different impetus
Yeah.
on age of facility or level, it changes the game, and therefore we have to get agreement on that prior to doing it.
Right. So again, if we keep the criteria the same, you wouldn't anticipate a reevaluation at this point would turn up anything different than we already have. If we change the criteria, then there would be a
believe so.
difference. Okay. How much does it cost to do an engineering study?
For 10?
While they're conferring on that one, I just wanted to clarify for the board what you all told us last time, and that's why this is a very important conversation. I know it's tedious, but it's very important because you all told us last time, revisit criteria
Right.
and maintain funded or named projects in the CIP cash flow, but reassess all remaining projects in the queue. So that means, I know that we're talking about these 10 that kind of get essentially,
Rearranged.
rearranged. It's really the whole list
Right. I know.
potentially could get rearranged. So
Right.
it just needs, we just need to be clear.
Need to
Because I
understand.
think the way it's been done in the past is if it was reevaluated, you would start with projects beyond those already. You would start
That's
with
right.
those
That's
not
right. The last time we did
named.
this, we got to the end of the queue and then
That's
started
correct.
over.
And so that's why this is very important for us to be clear about, because if we do what you all had essentially suggested, it could rearrange all of the schools listed on the
Right.
current queue.
So that is, right. And so that's the challenge. So anyway, how much does it cost to do an engineering?
I'm not
Ballpark?
sure, what it would cost, a couple $100,000. I have to get some estimates on it, and it
Yeah, 'cause
depends
I
on
don't
what we want
remember.
the ratings on.
Okay. All right. And so short of having another, either changing the criteria and then having another engineering study, if we rearrange the queue, there would have to be some reason for doing that. In other words, that if we upset the apple cart and it looks this way, then the question is people would come back and say, well, why did you do it on what basis? And so that's the challenge. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to talk before I do go back, so I don't know if there's anybody else that hasn't spoken. Okay, you're going to miss.
Looking at CIP passed earlier, for Church High School. So most of the required funding under CIP will go into from FY 2020 to 2024, correct? I see total amount being about 94 million and about 92.5 is from 2020 to 2024. That's the only promise we are making to public at this point, that that's what we see happening in the future. Those 10 schools, it's on the next page. I know you're not looking at this. Renovation of 10 schools for the total sum of $235 million. $234 million out of $235 million expected to be needed will be going in 2020 to 2024, according to CIP. So basically around the same time. For Church High School and 10 schools to be renovated. So, were you assuming that based upon the board's discussion from the last work session, going into that option, third option, keeping the schools in cash flow, CIP cash flow, and name the project because First Church was named, even though it hasn't been funded, named, were you assuming that First Church will be ahead of the other 10, no matter what, even though it's all within the same time frame, 2020 and 2024? And there seems to be some opinion, some view from board members that maybe at least among those 11 schools, funding will be needed all the same period of time. And with the 2017 bonding decision, which schools, which projects to be listed on 2017 bond, do not have to be decided until about spring 2017. So we have almost 2 years. 2 years, whether some sort of a quick study, not looking at all schools, but maybe just 11 schools at least, see whether that's the right order, First Church first, and then the other 10 schools. Granted that the board, because based upon the last work session discussion, the board wanted to come up with a new, look at the new criteria. We might, board might end up sticking with the same criteria that was used 7-8 years ago, but wanted to review the criteria. If the board timely review those criteria and gives you, wouldn't that give you enough time to hire someone from outside, at least to take a look at 11 before the spring 2017?
Yes, I mean, that's essentially, Mr. Moon, you've led us directly where we had said if we have the criteria and the weighting that does provide the time to do that, if we're able to go ahead and get through that process of selecting what that may be. Yes, it does have the time frame built in to do it.
Discussion, even though this is the third time we're doing this, the discussion so far has been somewhat confusing to at least some of us. we are rushing toward the end of the last work session. And now, finally, superintendent seeking clarification from board members whether this is what you meant. And there still seems to be some confusion among us. Given that, whatever the decision we make, the board make, we will have to be able to intelligently be able to engage the public and be able to answer questions. Then I would support Mr. Stork's advocacy that board engage in reviewing the criteria as agreed last time, and come up with criteria. Then at least look at those 11 schools, so that we can justify to public that the needs of First Church High School is more critical, more dire than those 10 schools who may be ahead in the current queue.
Can I restate, Mr. Moon,
Yes.
so that I make sure that we all understand what you're saying? Because even with the change, assuming that you all support the change that was made last time, the earliest Falls Church High School would affect any funding would be the fall of 2017 bond for planning. So with that being said, could we not go ahead and reevaluate the criteria and go ahead and secure a firm, an engineering firm, to come in and help us apply criteria to these schools so that we have some rationale or outside third-party evaluation to help influence that there's still time to do that? Did I hear you correctly, Mr. Moon?
That's what I meant to say, and you heard me correctly. Because as far as even though there are other schools even beyond those 10 schools to be renovated on the queue, at least from public's point of view, on our CIP states that 10 schools to be renovated in 2020, 2024. The members in those school communities might have been waiting.
No, I thought you were very clear. I thought you were very clear, Mr. Moon. I was just checking for understanding.
If we do not have a time to review, take a look at every school, every remaining school on the list, at least those 10 schools, and compare the needs of those based upon whatever the criteria we come up with, and see the needs of a First Church High School and whether it makes a sense to start with a First Church High School, or First Church could be somewhere in the middle. We won't know until we actually see what the expert might tell us.
Could I ask for you just clarification?
Yes, ma'am.
So you're saying just those 11, the 10 in Falls Church?
Just 11, just those 11, unless, outside consultants tells us that, oh, gosh, we can do all of that in 3 months' time frame.
And based on just the sidebar here, Mr. Moon, if we have the new criteria done by this fall, by this calendar year, we believe the engineering firm could do all of the projects. They did all 63 schools in 1 year. But the key is coming up with the criteria. So we need to make sure we have identified and the board has made decision on the new criteria.
Thank you.
So what I hear is coming up and modifying or adjusting the current criteria, get that done by December of this current calendar year, and then securing an engineering firm to work with us starting in the spring to evaluate all of our facilities according to that new criteria, including the 11 that would be potentially affected by this change.
Well, excuse me, that's just so different than what Il Young just answered me.
No, it's not.
No, it's not. It's just whether or not you want to evaluate just the 11 or you want to go ahead and do all of them. It was the same thing. It's just whether or not it's 11 or
Okay,
or
so then
all of
Falls
them.
Church could go down lower.
Sandy, I'm going to try to keep some order, and we will put things out and state them, and we'll make a decision of the board. I have Ryan next.
I was just going to mention what Susan said, and that if we're going to pay $200,000 plus for them to go through and redo these 11 schools, why don't we have them do them all? Financially, it doesn't make sense to just do 11.
Okay, so I'm going to speak before we do go-backs. I have always been a believer, and I've stated this, that I don't believe in jumping over schools that have been ranked. It's a core belief of mine that you have an independent look at these schools and that their needs are great, and that the needs can't be evaluated by walking through a school and looking at it. That's why we have engineering firms come in and look at all the systems in a school. And I'm not parochial about this. It's not a matter to me of whether it's my school on the list or not, but we also need to be cautious to just say the location that the school is physically located in doesn't mean where the kids come from. You know, Crossfield is in Hunter Mill, but the majority of the kids are in Sully. But to me, the responsibility, even if none of these were in Sully, is to look at that independent ranking and honor that. So my advocacy would be not to let Falls Church jump over those 10 schools, to keep them in order. Now, the conversation has changed with another idea of ranking sooner. And it sounds like from the cash flow issue that if we did this on the timeline that the superintendent said we could reevaluate, but we would still have enough schools named that we could keep working forward. It wouldn't create a gap. Okay, so we still have time. So you're fine for the 15 bond. So my advocacy in that piece, I wouldn't recommend only evaluating 11 schools. I think if we're going to go to the effort to say we're going to reevaluate, and that we start with Hybla Valley, I guess, that's where we start the reevaluation, then we would determine which schools should be reevaluated. I don't think it makes sense to say, oh, those 11 were the worst, we go there. So I want people to be thinking, this is what I'm hearing that we're talking about. The one piece that some board members thought we had agreed to, but you can tell from this conversation that there was confusion, that one decision would be that it is the funded and named, which would have Falls Church included and 10 elementaries be skipped. So some people might want to do that. Another choice would be that we say we do the funded and name, but we keep the schools up to Falls Church and we end it with Falls Church and we keep that order. And then the third thing that I'm hearing today is that we stop with, I guess in a way you say, Frost, or start with Hybla Valley and we just re-rank everything. And that we do that in the time frame so we're not making the decision of where the school should fall. So to me, I see three different things for us to kind of address and get agreement about. I'm going to go to my go-back list. I have Tammy, Megan, Patty, Ted.
I always appreciate the work sessions because my colleagues often, the conversation leads us to broader thought processes and good plans. So at this point, since that option was not on the table when I originally had talked about that, because I agree with you, Ms. Smith, for the reasons that you stated, not to jump the clue, because what we need is we need that independent without the emotion behind it. We need that independent ranking. Susan Quinn just told us, that she felt that, staff just told us that they felt that, we could get this done, the Dan and Ilyan's idea prior to and in time for funding. And Susan indicated that the last time that we did this, it may be able to go well beyond the 11 schools, but go to the whole listing of schools. So my advocacy at this time would be for that, but we as a board prior to this have to buckle down and relook at what we want to do as far as the criteria.
Thank you. Megan, Patty, then Ted.
First thing I want to do is clarify any misunderstandings from things my colleagues have said. Anyone who knows me knows that I have a record of almost 10 years of education advocacy that has, number one, always been based on objective data and research. So for anyone who thinks that I judge the needs of a school by when I walk into it and does it feel good, or does it look good, or does it need a renovation or not? That is absolutely not what I was saying. What I asked was for our staff's professional assessment based on the fact that we have a criteria and a ranking done from 2009. And barring anything else from that, I wanted to talk to the experts. So it does concern me today to hear some people making remarks that I actually find really troubling. That any one of us on this board would be making emotional decisions or be making decisions based on superficial criteria. I appreciate both Mr. Stork and Mr. Moon coming up with proposals here that, again, go to the heart of what all of this work is supposed to be about. How do we objectively make the most important decisions facing a school system that has such a backlog in construction and renovation needs? I will still go to the fact that whatever decisions were made by a prior board, this board has to answer for the decisions it makes every year when it passes the CIP. And so I am far more comfortable with this conversation of saying, regardless of decisions in the past, if this board believes there is a better set of criteria with weighting to that criteria, then we have a leadership responsibility to determine that by the end of this calendar year and allow for then Dr. Garza and her team to consult with the experts who can come in. And I certainly think that if it is Dr. Garza's leadership team's recommendation, Mr. Plattenberg, that they can do all 63 of the schools that are on here in time for the next bond, then I do think that's the most fair and objective way to approach this, the 17 bond.
I just want to catch that because I was looking. So you support doing the reevaluation?
As long as what I understood that this whole discussion today was never going to elevate Falls Church before the 2017 bond anyway. So now we're talking about, for everyone's concern, that you have the experts who will give the.
I got it.
Well, I'm looking for them to nod since you just asked that's correct.
Yeah. Okay, Patty.
Well, I have to admit that I'm very frustrated because I feel like we have talked about this and talked about it, and I understand that staff is confused because I think we're all still very confused. And I think part of it is that we haven't really talked about our values. And for me, when I see words like fundamental educational requirements, and then I look at facility condition and age, 80%, and I look at a school like Falls Church, and I compare, I've been sitting here comparing the information on the 10 elementary schools in terms of the year that it was built and capacity added or renovated, as well as all the high schools. And I can share with you that Falls Church is an outlier in any way you look at it. In terms of when it was first built in 1967, it hasn't been touched since 1989. And some of these schools, 3 of the elementary schools were built in the 1980s. I mean, to me, that's apples and oranges. And when we talk about the value of educational equity, and we have one high school out of this whole list that I can share with my colleagues that has not been touched since 1989, how on God's green earth can we say that our high schools offer the same quality of education? I mean, the labs themselves, you know, there's certain spaces, I think, that if we're offering high school education as an example, and we're talking about the quality of education, then to Ms. Derenak-Kofak's point, then maybe we need to be revising the criteria themselves to capture these kind of values. So I would say my first choice would be to move up Falls Church, because I thought we already did that. But if my colleagues, the majority, won't agree to that, then I do think that a systematic and fair reassessment of the remaining schools would be appropriate if we, in fact, agree on the criteria. I mean, I think that that's also an important factor as we look at reassessing this. And I also feel that we all represent all of these schools, in the end, right? We're all one county. So I hope that none of my colleagues will start feeling like, well, it's not fair to my school or your school. I mean, we have to do what's best for all of our schools. So somehow I hope that we can kind of change this dialogue and focus more on values and what's fair for our students. And if we need to start talking about high schools versus elementary schools, then so be it. I have no problem sharing my opinion on that. But the issue of educational quality and equity is one that I want to make sure gets put on the table as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty. Ted, Janie, then Elizabeth.
So I'm happy with the consensus that seems to be developing to come up with new criteria and evaluate all the schools. My only question is, what does all the schools mean? So there are a couple of options. One is that the queue remains intact through Silverbrook, or is it through Frost? I think we've decided that it's not Falls Church, which is the last yes on this list. So I'm just looking for clarification. Where is the cutoff going to be? I see it as either Silverbrook or Frost.
Mrs. Smith?
Somebody said Mrs. Smith. Was that Mr. Moon?
That was Moon.
Thank you.
I think in order to answer the question, I think
I
Mr.
would
Bell-
love to respond to that question.
Oh, I
from,
apologize.
Mr. Perkop, if you don't mind. Just as one board member, what I was thinking was this. As a member who supported the CIP, I voted yes to this CIP. I want to honor the CIP. I want to honor. Of course, that doesn't mean we can never change what the board has passed. But as one board member, I want to honor this, honoring First Church to be on 2017 bond. And as much as possible, funding to be between 2020 and 2024. At the same time, I would like to see 10 other schools wasn't named, but they were on the CIP. They were 10 schools to be renovated. And if they have to be on 2017 bond, I don't know how many will be on 2017 bond, but some of them or all of them, they will have to be on 2017 bonds, and funding will be done between 2020 and 2024. Now, who will get the money first? From 2020 to 2024? I'll wait and see what the expert tells us based upon criteria adopted by this board. But I want to honor the CIP that I voted for.
Okay. I have, Ted, did you have anything else?
The only thing I would say,
need
just to
clar-
add to that, to your question, I think Frost would have to remain in because it's already in the 2015 bond. And I mean, excuse me, I said Frost, I meant Cooper.
Right.
Cooper. So just to be clear, Mr. Velkoff, Cooper would not be, assuming you all want us to assess the remaining number, maybe a subset of that number, or the remaining number. I don't think Cooper Middle School could be in that reevaluation.
So this is the piece, and we need clarity. Are we changing what we're saying to keeping in funded and then whatever's showing up in the 15 bond? Because there are other schools that are named that aren't funded yet. And would those get reevaluated too? It gets complicated.
That's
And we
our
need clarity.
understanding.
We need to understand our decision.
Correct.
And so now it's complicated again.
Well, yeah, so our understanding, it would be Hybla Valley and Frost and everything below Frost onto the number 63. My understanding would be, it would be Hybla Valley, Frost, Washington Mill, Braddock, Fox Mill, Oak Hill, everything down to number 63. That is staff's current understanding. Current.
Okay. Ted, you're good? Janie, Elizabeth, and Sandy.
Two pieces that we're sort of looking at. One is that just the frustration that we don't have the money that we need in order to get to schools. Years ago when we said renovate every 25 years, well, Langley is 50 years old, and this is part of what makes all this so difficult, is that all of these schools are way too old by the time we get to them. All of them are. I think the other problem is we are looking at redoing the criteria is heavy lifting, but and I think that's just a given. The other third is, in listening to everybody else, one of the reasons why we've been very successful in passing our bonds over the years is that the order of the queue has been determined by a third-party engineering firm. In other words, it's not based on individual school board judgment. But I also hear my colleagues who are very frustrated because schools are so far down the list. So if I were going to weigh all of that, I would prefer to do the heavy lifting, look at the criteria again, look at everybody from Frost on down, including Hybla Valley, and including Falls Church, redo the criteria, have an engineering study, and then redo the whole list and see where it falls. Because when we did this in 2007, 2008, it was partly because, again, we hadn't looked at it in so long, and we decided we need to look at it again. So,
okay, you support the evaluation.
I do, and looking at the criteria and then evaluating it and then see how it falls.
I'm going to keep us moving on. Let's try to speak with impeccability. Elizabeth and then Sandy.
It's very difficult to have a conversation here about honoring the CIP in the situation that I find myself. I have a school in my backyard that had CIP planning money and was taken away and closed. And had the CIP been honored, frankly, I wouldn't be here today. So I have to honor my constitutional obligation and my oath. And that is to help lead this division with utmost efficiency. And I think that if a independent assessment of the criteria at any point in any year helps this board make its decisions better, more soundly, and the stewardship is first to the taxpayer and the taxpayers' dollars so that we ensure an ongoing, excellent relationship with our stakeholder community, then we ought to do it. And we ought not do it in a limited, ham-handed focus so that we are, getting enough information to make decisions now. Is the entire reason I spent a whole day on Saturday around strategic focus and trying to get some consensus with the board on doing long-range strategic planning so that we can plan for more than 1 or 2 or 3 years at a time. And capital infrastructure is the number one problem with 1,000 trailers that we have in not planning long-term. So of course we ought to have a broader scope than a smaller scope in terms of an assessment. And if it needs to be broader than is even being contemplated at the table in order to assess what we have available to us and how we are to best dispense with the taxpayers' money in renovating, building, adding seats, not adding seats where we don't need to, then that's what we need to do. But I will not be hamstrung by a commitment of a board from 6 or 10 years ago and put our feet in concrete and say, in 2016, we need to commit to what some previous board did at 2008.
Elizabeth, what's your advocacy, please? We're over time.
Yeah, I know we're over time, and I've used very little of it. So let's not cut ourselves short by saying that we're going to limit it to what's here. How about let's do at minimum what's here, but if anything else needs to be looked at, now's the time to amortize a review and look at whatever needs to be looked at.
Okay, so you support evaluation, and I agree. There might be schools that have been renovated that need to be reevaluated again years ago. Okay, I have Sandy.
So on the dashboard, Hybla Valley is listed as having been renovated in 2010. What's that about?
I just had an addition.
It had an addition, and did that addition push all the other projects lower in the queue?
Well, any capacity, remember, capacity always takes priority over renovation. So any new school, addition, modular, irregardless, will always push a
The answer to your
renovation.
question is yes, because the
Yeah.
reality is the cap, the lack of funding, what was stated by Ms. Strauss. The real issue here is we have $155 million a year, and we have needs that well exceed $274 million.
So anytime we put an addition or
Anytime
add
we
a new
spend,
school,
or a
we
modular,
push
anytime we spend
everybody
any
and
capital
any
money, it
modular.
impacts adversely.
And even though every time we do that, we don't look at the queue again and say, well, you know you're going to push these schools back by a year or 18 months or
We come back with the
3
CIP.
years.
That's why it's a 5-year projection that's revisited annually.
Okay, so Hybla Valley's gotten an addition that pushed everybody else down the queue. The problem I have with what the conversation we're having now is that it all sounds very well and good to have this independent analysis. The last time we had an independent analysis, Falls Church High School was disadvantaged by having a program for the physically disabled. And that's just not right. It's just not right. And we have brought this to facilities staff, and they have told us there's nothing to be done about it. There's nothing to be done about the fact that we've got kids in wheelchairs, and they were disadvantaged in the queue because of that. They got a 5 in that category, where it's Oakton got a 0, and Langley got a 0, and TJ got a 0. And that's just not right. So if we're going to do this, we better be sure that the criteria make sense. You know, the age of this building, this was built in the 1960s. We've got schools here that were built in the 1980s that are ahead of Falls Church now. And age is only 10% under the current. Code compliance is 10%, but we're told Falls Church is in compliance because they're grandfathered. They don't meet current ADA. Isn't that right, Mr. Plattenberg? They don't meet the new?
They do meet the current ADA. The reality is the whole ADA, and this is where a lot of the misinformation that's gone on and on and on about this issue. The reality is that as was stated, you know, we have needs that are much greater than our ability to compensate for. They meet the ADA requirements as they exist.
But that's because they're grandfathered, right?
That's because the existing ADA is based upon the age of the facility and when it was built. So you could say grandfathered. Whenever there's an accommodation that has to be met that's identified at each individual school, regardless of the age that it was built, we address it. And although people are passionate about the queue and saying Falls Church, and this conversation really has been predominantly dominated by a lot of Falls Church discussion, the reality of the situation is Falls Church benefited from the relook that was done afterwards when capacity was taken out.
I understand that.
And that's moving it forward. I mean, I can't address a lot of those issues of the past, and that's why I think this is a healthy dialogue and discussion about revisiting, reevaluating, but we will have to come up with a criteria and a percentage rating.
Right, and so our discussion assumes that the criteria will make sense. The discussion assumes that the independent analysis will make sense. And if I were assured that that were the case in my own mind, but the last time it didn't work out that way. We now, if under the best case scenario, Falls Church is in the 2017 bond and gets renovated in 2024, that'll be 57 years for this high school. You know, our high school with the second highest percent of free and reduced lunch, where the science labs look terrible. Anyway,
Okay.
So my advocacy, you're wanting, I like Mr. Moon's original idea of getting the criteria and reevaluating the 11, because at least that protects Falls Church from going lower. Because I'm just not that confident that if we have that this board can come up with criteria that doesn't make it go lower. There's no protection. I want some protection that it won't go lower.
Okay, I have Mr. Velkoff, and then I want to get to some decision-making here, please.
You know, as I listen to this, I have to do a root cause analysis. You know, we're sitting here as part of a circular firing squad for the past hour and a half. And it's very painful, but the real problem here is limited funding. The supervisors don't have the authority to just simply vote on a meals tax and give us an extra $80 million towards funding these things. And we're fighting each other because Richmond doesn't let us govern.
Okay. So the majority, I took notes on everybody speaking. It sounds like the decision of the board is to reevaluate the schools. I heard Sandy say only do the 11. Other people said do them all. We heard staff say they could all be done. My advocacy is that we just need to do what needs to be done and get it over and done with because we want the list to go forward. And that we would set a date for sometime this fall to do the criteria. Okay? So I guess head nods. Are people in agreement? We're going to reevaluate the schools. And
Yeah, you have
right,
to do the
after
criteria
we'll do
first.
the
We'll do that in the
criteria.
fall.
Yeah, be careful of when in the fall.
Yeah.
Because people will be busy, but we need to schedule that in enough time. So that will be our next step, is that we don't know how many schools. That's what's going to have to be looked at. We can't determine right now, sitting here, how many schools it's going to be.
The full list is 63, and you already have half the schools that have already been funded and completed. Yeah.
Well, my question with that, which Elizabeth raised, is are there any other schools that should be part of the evaluation or not? Does it just have to be those, or are there any more? Ryan?
So I would just advocate for a price quote for the 11 versus the 63.
Right, it's less than 63.
It's less than 63. Yeah.
Right. Okay, consensus, where is that? Consensus of the board will reevaluate the renovation criteria by December 2015, and then we'll hire an engineering firm to independently evaluate and rank. It needs to be not just the 11 schools. We decided that we would evaluate. I've heard enough people say we just need to evaluate the schools, at minimum the 11. That's a good way to put it. Well, I don't know.
I think that those decisions can wait until we do the criteria.
At minimum, the 11 schools using the newly revised criteria, and I wouldn't worry about, take that out. Okay. I don't know, does she need a date with the evaluation? No, I wouldn't worry about that now either. Don't worry about it, just take that out. We're just going to let's deal with the criteria first. Okay? So are we good?
I just
Patty?
had one question of scope, and when Ms. Schultz mentioned the idea of maybe it would be other facilities other than what's listed on through number 63, that just begs the question, since we're trying to be clear, would that mean possibly looking at some of our other facilities that are listed in the CIP as perhaps coming back online in the next handful of years? Should that also be part of the assessment, so that we'd have a sense for how much it would cost, to add capacity or something at one of those
and my
places?
advocates, there are schools, if you contemplate the fact, if you think about, we did this assessment in 2008, it's roughly 6 or 7 years later, there's probably schools that, in theory, have aged in to eventually be included in a queue. Of course, look at the length of the queue. I mean, we could introduce those schools again, and they would be part of a list. But I think the last work session I mentioned schools like Luther Jackson possibly being included.
So I think if we can leave it that staff would look at the list of schools that should be included, and if it's anything after the list of 63, I think it's that push between how quick can you accomplish it. You get frustrated when the list is too long, but we're not going to have that answer now. But after we develop the criteria, then staff would show us which schools would get evaluated. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fine. But again, I just want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about. Graham Road, Leeds Center, Pimmett. Clifton, whatever the other ones are that are out there and that you've mentioned in the inventory. I just think if we're looking at this, that might be a good time, if you think it's appropriate and, within the scope, that we'd look at that as well. That's all. Thank you.
Ted?
So I want to be really clear, because the last time we weren't clear, and I got something different than I thought I was getting. So can we say that it's all the schools excluding schools 1 through 32 and 34? Is there a reason why we can't say that? Because, well, what I'm concerned about is that potentially
Ted,
if we say
this was a simple question.
Okay.
You're talking about the renovation queue list. And say it again, which ones?
We exclude 1 through 32 and 34 because they're already in progress. We're not going to re-rank any of those.
Right.
Right? Okay.
That's clarity.
So let's put those
Okay.
precisely in here to make clear that those are not included, and now we're good.
Okay. That's good clarity. Okay. Ryan wanted a request for a quote for what the engineering study would be. Okay.
It's 30. It's 30 on this.
They're going to get an estimate of the cost to do the engineering study based on 11 schools or more than 11 schools, the difference, whatever the cost. Versus more. I don't know that all is the right, the number.
No, Pam, there's
it's not
about 30 on the
63.
list. Karen counted, she just counted.
30
There's 30 on
plus
the...
potentially schools not currently being used as schools. Yeah, we'll know.
Versus, it might be safer to put versus a larger amount to be evaluated. I don't
Right.
know, because it might not be that specific number. Megan?
What I heard myself and many colleagues talk about in supporting this proposal here was that the goal, again, it's just an estimated time frame, that we're trying to have the revised list by summer of 2016
Yes.
in time for the bond 2017. I don't see it listed there, and I think for the public's sake, if anyone were to read this in a vacuum, they would be saying, and so
Okay,
then what? So I do
so-
think those are important timelines.
So these decisions will be made in time for the 2017 bond. Okay?
That's good enough for the 27 bond.
You can edit and make the words sound so much better, I'm sure. Okay, we're going to take a 7-minute break and then come back and start the next work session.
Okay.